The perspective that I take on the history of the American response to Dutch art and the canonization of Dutch art within the United States is primarily a post colonial one, bearing in mind that here in New York, we are in a former Dutch colony, formerly New Amsterdam, within the colony of New Netherland. And you see here a map with key sites from New Netherland mapped onto the contemporary United States, and then a 17th century map. I've included the dates for the official duration of Dutch colonization here in North America, but it's important to bear in mind that Dutch culture persisted far beyond 1667. Dutch continued to be a commonly spoken native language in New York into the first decade of the 19th century. And our language in New York, when we talk about sitting on the stoop or eating coleslaw, still reflects our Dutch heritage. I've also included this 17th century map of New Netherland because it gives indications not only of Dutch settler colonialism, but also the presence of the indigenous population of the area, including some of their architecture, the names of various communities. Here in New York, we are on the traditional homeland of the Lenape people. And unlike our Dutch heritage, that is a heritage and a history that I think we're still in very early stages of even beginning to acknowledge and respect, particularly in our cultural institutions. A key factor in the reception of Dutch art, the canonization of Dutch art in the United States, is the prestige attached to what I'm calling the patron legacy, or patroon in English. This is a term that designates the elite class of landowners who were given huge grants of land by the Dutch authorities and really ruled as a kind of feudal aristocracy within what is now New York State into the 19th century, when there was a major social uprising against their almost autocratic rule over the territories that they controlled. The material culture of patroon life has played an important part in the formation of a canon of early American art. I'm showing you two examples from the Met's own collection. So here we have the Van Rensselaer arms dating back to 1656. That were given to the Dutch Reformed Church in Beverwijk, which is now our state capital of Albany. So you see here a very clear expression of that aristocratic or pseudo-aristocratic identity on the part of one of the most powerful of the patroons. And then you see an interior created for the manor house of some of his 18th century descendants. And I've just included the information that this interior, or what we could call a period room now at the Met, was donated as late as 1928 by Mrs. William Bayard van Rensselaer, giving an indication of the continued status of these Dutch-descended elite patroon families well into the 20th century. And it's still sort of a cliche if you watch American television that old money families are often designated by Dutch names, beginning with Van der something. So there's still a cachet very much attached to this identity. And I want to point out that these objects of Dutch or Dutch influenced material culture are the beginning of the narrative that we tell about American art in the American wing of the Met. It's only in the past 2 or 3 years that we've begun to incorporate indigenous, often much more ancient indigenous material into that narrative of American art. The Dutch settlers living in what is now New York in the 17th century, of course, did have paintings with them. I'm showing one example, a family portrait, also now at the Met's collection. But these are not what we would think of as canonical examples of 17th century Dutch art. So we don't have any evidence of paintings by, for example, Rembrandt coming to the United States before the 19th century. The formation of great American collections of Dutch art really dates to the last quarter of the 19th century, the so-called Gilded Age in US history. This is the period after the end of the American Civil War in 1865, when there is an incredible growth in capital, in industrialization, also in social inequality here in the United States. And you have the foundation of many new civic institutions, symphonies, parks, universities, and of course, museums. The Met itself is founded in 1870, but it's founded without a collection and without a building. So it doesn't actually open to the public until 1872. And you see here a newspaper illustration of that opening reception. The first art to be acquired by the museum was a group of paintings purchased in Paris and Brussels in 1871 in the midst of the Franco-Prussian War. And overwhelmingly, these were Flemish and Dutch paintings. I'm showing you a few examples from that founding purchase. The trustees at the time were very eager to acquire what they considered to be the most prestigious examples of European art. They had a sense of a didactic mission to bring European culture to New York, to educate American artists through the example of European masters. And partly because so many of these first trustees, the wealthiest citizens of New York, were of Dutch descent, they very much placed Dutch art at the heart of the canon that they presented with this founding purchase. It's often said that Protestant American collectors were wary of acquiring Flemish devotional pictures. It's true to a certain extent. We didn't have a major religious picture by Rubens at the Met until about 1910. But there was one key exception in this founding purchase of 1871, Van Dyck's St. Rosalie interceding for the plague-stricken of Palermo. And you see it here in this very charming painting by Frank Waller depicting the appearance of the original Met. I want to point out, though, that even though Dutch art had an extremely high status among collectors, a status that's really maintained, I would say, up to the present day, it still had a fairly ambivalent reception on the part of art critics, particularly those who still were very much informed by ideals of classicism, idealism, and French and Italian art. The great American novelist Henry James actually reviewed our opening exhibition in 1872, and his remarks about this portrait by van der Helst, I think, are illuminating about the ambiguous status of Dutch art at the time. So he called this portrait the perfect prose of portraiture. We doubt that the mouth and chin of small local authority were ever more inexorably fixed in their pursy identity than these comfortable attributes of this most respectable Dutchman. It seems almost hyperbolical to talk of van der Helst as an artist. Genuine painter as he was, his process is not so much the common, leisurely, critical return upon reality and truth as a bonded and indissoluble union with it, so that in all his unmitigated verity, you detect no faintest throb of invention blossoming into style and straggling across the line which separates a fine likeness from a fine portrait. So I think you'll recognize here a number of 18th and 19th century cliches about Dutch art, that it might not even be art. It's too real, it's too close to reality, it's too scrupulous in its surface effects and its realism. And I think that we should bear that status in mind as we think about the great purchases of Dutch and Flemish painting that were made over subsequent decades. A key figure in the formation of the Met's Dutch collection was our early trustee, Henry Marquand. I'm showing you the wonderful Van Dyck portrait that he bought for the Met from an aristocratic collection in England. And here it is installed in the gallery that bore his name at the museum. And Marquand's letters are very explicit about this didactic function that he intended his acquisitions to have. He says he's hoping to educate a young or a new nation. So there's a sense that we have a kind of cultural immaturity here, and we need to turn to these European masters, to this canon, import it to the country in order to educate ourselves and create an independent, mature cultural identity. These are two more examples of the kind of Dutch canonical painting that began to enter American collections during these decades. There really was an emphasis on the work of three artists, Vermeer, Rembrandt, and Frans Hals. Um, I've included the prices paid by American collectors for these paintings because I think it is illuminating about how a canon can shift. So Marquand acquired the first Vermeer to come to America in 1887, a woman with a water pitcher, today one of the true icons of the Met. And he only paid $800 for it. This is a moment when Vermeer is just being really rediscovered by primarily French critics and writers. Um, but his prices haven't really caught up to that critical reappraisal. By contrast, Mr. and Mrs. Havemeyer paid $80,000 for this Rembrandt portrait, a breathtaking sum at the time. The real apogee of New York's engagement with its Dutch heritage came in 1909. This was the tercentenary of Henry Hudson's navigation of the river that would come to be called the Hudson River after him. And this was a moment when New York really embraced its Dutch heritage as a way to distinguish itself from cities like Boston or Philadelphia that actually had a much more prestigious history in the colonial period. And I think there's an interesting tension between the way that Americans have responded to Dutch colonialism and British colonialism. I think the relationship to Britain has historically been more fraught. We fought two very violent wars of independence against the British. And I think because we continue more or less to share a language with the English, there is a sort of a proximity, but also a real tension there. I think the Dutch colonial heritage was perceived at a certain moment as being more benign. And that certainly was the case during this Hudson Fulton celebration, one of the biggest civic festivals New York has ever seen. It featured things like a full-scale recreation of Hudson's ship, the Half Moon, sailing up the Hudson River from New York to Albany. And it also included, importantly for our purposes, an art exhibition held at the Met. All of these paintings that you see here were at the time still in private collections. So this was a show of the strengths of the great private collections that had sprung up over the past 25 years, primarily in New York City. And you'll recognize in this shot a number of paintings that have subsequently become key works in American museums, such as these two examples by Rembrandt that I'm showing here. So even though this was meant to be a reflection on 17th century Dutch colonialism in New York, there also was an emphasis on the recent acquisition or appropriation of some of the most prestigious canonical productions of Dutch culture. So a real show of strength about contemporary American collecting as well. And the critical response to this exhibition reflects, I think, the increased status of Dutch art in critical discourse since Henry James wrote in 1872. So I'm quoting here Kenyon Cox, who's talking about Vermeer's Lute Player, which he said, "It is this picture without provenance and without history, until now uncatalogued and undescribed, which is that pearl of price, a perfect work in perfect condition of the most perfect painter that ever lived." So you really can't get more canonical than that for a work to be termed over and over again perfect. Vermeer has become a byword for perfection. And you see in the example of this genre scene by William McGregor Paxton, painted the same year as the Hudson Fulton exhibition, what an impact Vermeer began to have on contemporary American art, the type of contemporary art that was being acquired or given to the Met at this time. And this sense that the Dutch masters, particularly Rembrandt and Vermeer, are bywords for perfection, for the most blue chip of European paintings, really continues throughout the 20th century. And it's often associated with high prices being achieved at auction. So we talked about the Vermeer selling for $800 back in the 1880s. Another key milestone is the Met's acquisition of Rembrandt's Aristotle Contemplating the Bust of Homer, sold in the 1960s for then an unthinkable sum of $2.3 million. And the newspapers at the time, here you see the New York Times, noted not only this number, the price of the painting, but also then the number of visitors who flocked to see it when it was installed at the museum. So 42,000 by this count. And I still get approached actually in our galleries when I give tours by older visitors who remember this sale and coming to the museum with their parents as children. So I think when we talk about canonization, there is a certain quantitative aspect to it of the price that a market accords to a work, and also the visitorship, the popular enthusiasm that it can inspire. The Met's purchase of this painting was made possible through the generosity of Mr. and Mrs. Charles and Jane Reitzman, who really embody for me that continued, I would say, sort of fantasy of identification with European aristocratic culture that has been part of America since those patrons of the 17th century. So here you see Cecil Beaton's photograph of Mrs. Reitzman in her Fifth Avenue apartment, again, occupying this fantasy interior of European aristocratic life with French boiserie and furniture, mice and birds mounted on the wall, and then, of course, her great Vermeer, one of the first old masters that she and her husband acquired, and then one of many paintings that they would subsequently give to the Met. The Reitzmans were by no means descended from Dutch old money. Had they owed their money to oil out west. They were both Westerners from Oklahoma and California. But when they came to New York, when they wanted to enter New York high society, they did so through collecting canonical old masters and works of decorative art. And really, I think this Vermeer acquisition that they made in the 1950s was what put them on the map, so to speak, both as collectors and as members of New York society. And I think that this dependence of the museum on the largesse of these great collectors and the association between Dutch painting and a certain kind of white Protestant social elite is one reason that this canon has very rightfully been called into question recently. And it's also a reason that we have so many lacunae, so many blind spots in our collection. When I was tasked with creating a new presentation of our 17th century Dutch paintings, I realized that despite the fact that we live in a former Dutch colony, we have very few images that allow us to talk about colonization, that allow us to talk about race, diversity. And so I'm grateful for this curatorial purchase made in 1981, a Brazilian landscape by Franz Post. And I'll just conclude by saying that our canon, our group of Dutch paintings here, is not static. We continue to expand it. In 1871, we acquired the work of one Dutch woman artist, Margaretha Haverman, and we didn't acquire or receive as a gift any others until 2020, when we were able to purchase this work of Clara Peters. So this is a canon, a collection with many gaps, but one that we are actively working to expand and to question. But thank you.